distinguished comrades on the dais, comrades and friends. First of all, I am extremely grateful that I have been given this opportunity to come and release the book and also to share some thoughts with you, which I have been having for a very long time. As Comrade Dhavale said, Kerala was one of the states in which the cooperative movement was assiduously promoted by the left, because of which, while in many other states, the cooperatives essentially have turned into fiefdoms of individual political figures, in Kerala, they remain a means of an instrument of class assertion. And this is something which comes out very clearly from the study, from the case studies in this particular volume, whether it is Dinesh Bedi, whether it is Kurumbashri, whatever it is, whether tea workers, peasants growing tea, you find that there is a class assertion which occurs because of the cooperative movement. Now, I think the cooperative movement today has acquired, again as Comrade Dhavale pointed out, has really acquired an enormous importance, particularly in the context of the neoliberal policies which are being pursued. The essence of the neoliberal policies is an attack by big capital on petty production, including peasant agriculture. Now, this attack takes the form not only of removing input subsidies, not only of removing price support, not only of removing extension services, not only of removing the support that the government used to provide in the form of investment in infrastructure, in the form of extension services catering to the distribution of seeds and so on, but also it takes the form of really taking over, squeezing the peasant agriculture sector, petty production sector. For instance, we know that cash crop prices fluctuate greatly in the international market. Now, earlier, the cash crop growers were protected against these price fluctuations because of the fact that we had various bodies that intervened in periods when prices in the world market crashed. And we had quantitative restrictions on imports, we had tariffs and so on, which actually adjusted domestic prices in a manner that international price fluctuations did not really affect the domestic growers. We had tea board, coffee board, coir board, rubber board, all these boards had a marketing function. As a result of neoliberal policies, the boards continue to exist, but the marketing function has completely disappeared, because of which international price fluctuations, which are very, whose amplitude is very high in the case of cash crops, they make themselves felt in the domestic market. And since cash crop growing is typically associated with substantial amounts of credit, the farmers are not able to pay back credit in years when the cash crop prices crash, because of which then they commit suicide. So very large numbers of farmer suicides are of cash crop farmers. I'm not saying only of cash crop farmers, but cash crop farmers really form the bulk of the peasants who have committed suicide. Even in the case of food grains, where the government tried to do away with the minimum support price mechanism and was prevented from doing so because of a year-long farmers' agitation, even there, the prices which the farmers have got really are extraordinarily low. I'll give you an example which is quite striking. When I joined Jawaharlal Nehru University in 1973, I joined as an associate professor. The basic salary of an associate professor, basic salary, was 700 rupees per month. At that time, the procurement price of wheat, let us say, was about 70 to 75 rupees per quintal. Today, the procurement price for wheat is about 2,200 rupees per quintal or 2,500. So roughly, let us say, it has gone up by 30 times. If one was the price in 1973 of the procurement price of a quintal, today it is about 30. But the basic salary of an associate professor in a central university today is about 1.5 lakhs. 700 to 1.5 lakhs is in fact a 200 times increase. And academics in India are not a pampered lot. They are not among the highest paid. We have all read stories about the incredible increase in income and wealth inequalities, where a Hollywood star is invited to perform in a wedding and is paid 17 crores, 18 crores for one night's performance. So that is the kind of inequality we are talking about. And in that, while the academics are not among the pampered lot, nonetheless, they are in a better position than the peasants. As I said, 1:30 compared to 1:200. So it just shows how badly the farmers have been treated in the entire neoliberal period. It's not surprising that a very large number of them have actually given up agriculture. About 15 million if you compare 1991 census with the 2011 census. The number of cultivators in the 2011 census is 15 million less than in 1991. Some of them may have become laborers, others would have migrated to cities in search of jobs, which again are non-existent, because the employment growth or the job growth has, even though we talk much, the government talks much about the acceleration in GDP growth, the employment growth, the job growth has actually decelerated compared to the earlier period. In the earlier period, it was about 2% per annum was the magnitude of job growth. We used to criticize it, saying that, look, population growth is about that much, a little bit more than that, if anything, which basically means that the workforce growth would be about that much, and therefore your job growth is just about keeping up with or is marginally short of the workforce growth, in which case the enormous amount of reserve army of labor that we inherit from colonial times is not going to be used up. So our criticism of the Nehruvian strategy was that, look, you're simply not doing enough to absorb the backlog of unemployment that constitutes the reserve army of labor. While now the job growth has actually become less compared even to the earlier period, while there is some slowing down of the rate of growth of population, therefore the workforce, the rate of growth of workforce is still higher than the rate of job growth, in which case the reserve army of labor, instead of getting reduced in relative terms, is actually increasing, and thereby poverty is increasing. There is a massive obfuscation on the issue of poverty, and then you find all this complete nonsense which is being spread that, in India poverty is now 5%, is going to disappear in 5 years' time and so on. It's complete nonsense. You actually find that the fundamental poverty defined in terms which the Planning Commission itself had used in 1973-74, namely the number of persons who have access to 2200 calories in rural India and 2100 calories in urban India, that proportion has increased significantly between the introduction of neoliberal policies and now. Therefore, you have a rise in reserve army of labor, a rise in the magnitude of poverty, the rise in the relative size of the reserve army of labor, rise in the magnitude of poverty, and all this is associated also with a massive attack on peasant agriculture and petty production in general. The point is that against this attack on peasant agriculture, so far we have been talking in terms of, the strategy has been to mobilize the peasants politically against this attack, which of course is absolutely right, correct, desirable, and deserves priority. But at the same time, it seems to me that political mobilization of the peasants is just not enough. What we need is a new set of institutions in rural India which would play the role, and this is true of petty production in general as well, but I'll confine myself to talking about peasant agriculture. We should play the role of actually providing an alternative, which could actually play the role of stiffening the class resistance of the peasants in addition to the political struggle that they are carrying on. Because political struggle still does not overcome the fact that they are individual peasants. Their individual atomized nature is not overcome. They're politically united, but in terms of basic production units, they remain individual atomized production units. But I think something has to be done about overcoming the state of individual atomization. And this has been a long debate in India, not recently. When I was a student in Delhi University, there was an intense debate on the whole question of cooperatives. There was one school of thought which argued that, look, the small farmers have higher productivity per acre. This is something which the farm management surveys of the 1950s had disclosed, that the productivity per acre on small farms was higher than the productivity per acre on large farms. Since India was an economy which was constrained by the size of land, if you want to increase agricultural output, in that case, you cannot really have large farms, even cooperatively owned large farms, because of the fact that that actually gives you lower productivity per acre. Putting differently, since land is a constraining factor, if you want to increase the size of agricultural output, then your objective should be to maximize the output that is obtained from an acre of land. That means productivity per acre. And if you want to maximize the productivity per acre, then any form of destroying individual small farms and converting them into large cooperative units is something which is undesirable. On the basis of this, many people had argued that what you need, of course, to support the peasantry is service cooperatives. You can have cooperative credit societies, cooperative, marketing societies and so on. But so while services can be cooperativized, cultivation should remain individual. This was the position that was taken by many people, including Professor Rajkrishna, very distinguished agricultural economist in Delhi University. And this was also the kind of position against any form of cooperative production that was taken by Chaudhary Charan Singh, who had written a very important book at that time called Cooperative Farming X-Rayed. Against this, however, there was a major kind of criticism from the left, and of course from many economists sympathetic to the left. For instance, Professor A.M. Khusro, who later became Vice Chancellor of Aligarh Muslim University, had written a very important book on cooperatives, which was really inspired by what was happening in China in those days. The whole argument of that book was that, look, when you have cooperatives, then you can actually you can mobilize large numbers, large amounts of unused resources. For instance, in a particular household, you may have a person who has some idle time. In some other household, you have a person who has some idle time. This idle time in individual households cannot be converted into anything, doesn't really produce anything. But if you aggregate this idle time across many households, in that case you would be able to obtain a supply of labor that can be used for capital formation, that can be used for bunding, that can be used for digging channels, that can be used for fencing and so on, whatever. So you can actually build capital projects through an aggregation of unused resources which would otherwise remain unused if you could actually have a cooperative form of organizing production. This argument, which of course was very important at that time because of the Chinese experience with communes, the communes created an enormous amount of capital in addition to, for instance, if you have a commune, there would be a certain amount of planned funds that will come to the commune for capital projects. You had a centrally planned economy. That planned economy would, let us say, allocate a certain amount to a particular commune. That comrades, you use these funds for doing ABC of capital projects. But in addition to the planned funds, there was, because of the existence of communes, there was all these utilization of local resources which were lying unutilized otherwise, and this actually contributed a fair proportion of the total capital expenditure. Almost 20% of total capital expenditure in many communes was really generated within the commune itself, which did not depend on central planning or central devolution of planned funds. Exactly the same argument was put forward that in India, if you have an aggregation of these unused resources, which is possible if you can have organization of production on a cooperative or a collective basis, in that case you would be able to generate capital in addition to anything that central funding may provide you and thereby raise productivity. Now this argument was actually part of another bigger argument which had been put forward by Lenin. This idea of size productivity, the size productivity debate is not something specific to India, it is something which you find all over the world. And this idea of small size being more productive in terms of productivity per acre is something which Lenin had actually discussed and had refuted, because Lenin had said that really why are you looking only at the size of the plot? You should really look at the scale of agriculture. You may have a small plot in which there is a substantial amount of capital investment. You can have a small plot in which there is very little capital investment. Therefore, simply looking at size is not enough. You have to look at the scale. And if you look at the scale, then you'd find that higher scale of production is something which is more economical, more efficient. That instead of smaller size of farms being more efficient, higher scale of production is more efficient. The distinction in size and scale, on the basis of which there was a paper which was written by Comrade Utsa, it's called the Economics of Farm Size and Farm Scale, in which he actually found evidence that in India, if you forget about size, you simply look at the scale of operation, then you find that larger scale farms, scale of operation, you could take a proxy for larger scale in the form of larger value of output. Larger farms tended to have higher productivity per acre. Larger farms in scale terms, not in size terms, tended to have higher productivity per acre compared to smaller farms, which was really a confirmation of what Lenin had found much earlier. Now, if that is the case, then this whole argument that, that if you aggregate small farms into cooperative production units, if organization of production takes the form of building cooperatives and pooling land, in that case you would lose out in terms of productivity per acre. That argument becomes invalid, because the point is that you're not just pooling, but you're actually increasing the scale of production. Now, that being the case, it seems to me that there is a very strong, powerful argument for introducing the not just service cooperatives, not just cooperative credit marketing, but introducing production cooperatives. And the left, I think, should take this up. And what is more, of course we know that in any situation where the workers and peasants come to power, you would have to have higher forms of property supplanting individual peasant property in the transition to socialism. But even before the workers and peasants have come to power, I think the preparation for building these kinds of production cooperatives must begin right now, because it's a way of preventing the decimation of individual peasant agriculture by capitalist farming or by agribusiness, which then tends to dominate the peasants. If you have, in fact, cooperatives would not only be in that sense productively more efficient, but they would also be able to counterbalance the power of agribusiness even in the society in which we live, because they would be having much greater bargaining strength compared to the individual peasants. There is a further argument why I believe that institutional changes are not only important but should be introduced right now wherever the left is in a position to usher in such changes. After all, we don't visualize that a peasant would always remain a peasant. We don't visualize that a peasant's child would always remain a peasant's child. I think that's ridiculous. We have to have a situation in which the distinction between the town and country must disappear. True, that is a long-term goal, but on the other hand, everything we do must be informed by that basic long-term goal. That the peasants are not a separate category who forever remain as peasants, that we have to have the obliteration of the distinction between town and country. Now, if we are going to do that, in that case, not only is it very important that industrialization must come to the countryside, but what is more, industrialization in the countryside must not be at the expense of the farmers, must not be at the expense of the peasants. I think at the moment, one of the biggest problems being faced by the country is the dispossession of peasants by monopoly houses who then start industries in the agricultural, in rural areas, and get rid of the peasants, paying them some compensation which is not really particularly satisfactory from their point of view, and which certainly is not enough to necessarily give them a living forever. Now, if that is the case, that has been the cause for substantial peasant unrest. I should add that this substantial peasant unrest has occurred not only in India, it also occurs in other countries of the global south, including even China. Now, therefore, if we are going to think, so the problem, the classic problem we faced, for instance, in West Bengal, the left faced in West Bengal, that you want to industrialize, but if you want to industrialize, in that case, the peasants have to give up land in order to set up factories. And if the peasants give up land, then they resist this giving up, and therefore, if the left supports industrialization, the left loses its support within the peasantry, which is the kind of thing that actually, the kind of dilemma that we actually faced in West Bengal. Now, I think this dilemma can be broken if you actually have peasant cooperatives also industrializing. After all, Mr. Adani or Mr. Ambani or Mr. Tata, they don't know anything about engineering. They hire people who can then kind of, set up plants, design them and so on and so forth. Why can't a peasant cooperative do it? Why should it be that the task of setting up industry should be entrusted only to a group of monopolists? This task is something which can be taken over by institutions in rural areas themselves, in which case what the peasants would lose in terms of land use, they gain in terms of ownership over industry. This of course cannot be done by individual peasants, but forming cooperatives would be an easy way of transiting to this kind of an industrialization where the distinction between town and country would disappear. And that disappearance of the distinction is absolutely essential, because we don't want a situation where, as I said, the peasant children remain peasant children forever and so on. And from that point of view, again, of course, one can say that you have other institutions. In China, for instance, you had TVs, township and village enterprises. Similarly, you can have panchayats owning industry. That is not necessary that cooperatives should. But then we should have a multiplicity of institutions, and since we are talking about the loss of land, the loss of rights over land for the sake of industrialization, it is best if the loss of rights over land is something which is, as it were, counterbalanced by a specifically peasant organization. As I said, individual peasants cannot do this, but on the other hand, this is something which can be done if you have a cooperative. If you have a cooperative, that in the cooperative, individual peasants have already given their land. I'm talking about production cooperatives. Individual peasants have already given their land. There is no question of finding out how much compensation to give to this person, how much compensation to give to that person. The point is the cooperative has been formed, and the cooperative can then initiate industrialization on its own. I think that's a way of breaking this deadlock which has afflicted the progress of the left in West Bengal, which has cost us heavily in West Bengal and so on, because the peasantry had supported us solidly for 3 decades or more. But on the other hand, the fear of losing land is what actually alienated the peasantry from the left, and I think that whole problem can be overcome if we can think in terms of the peasants themselves owning industry, and the peasants can own industry only as a cooperative unit. Therefore, it's very important at this juncture, if we are going to fight neoliberalism, if we are going to fight the capitalist encroachment on petty production, which is the hallmark of neoliberalism, that we actually try our best to promote new institutions, particularly cooperative institutions, and cooperative institutions not just in the sense of service cooperatives, but cooperative institutions of production as well. And that, as I said, would also stand us in good stead when we have a government of workers and peasants, because then the transition towards more cooperative, collective forms of ownership, which is essential in the transition to socialism from individual petty ownership, would become that much easier. So these are some of the thoughts which have been agitating me for a long time, and I'm glad I got a chance to share them with you. Thank you very much.